Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, 8 Keys to a Defensible Network Architecture and How Zeek Can Help Get You There, sponsored by Corelight. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and Matt Bromiley of SANS will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Richard Bejtlich, Principal Security Strategist at Corelight, and Matt Bromiley, SANS Certified Digital Forensics and Incident Response Instructor. If in the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Richard.
Thanks, Carol. Hello, everyone. This is Richard Bejtlich. I'm happy to join Matt Bromiley today to talk to you about defensible network architecture and how the software formerly known as Bro, now renamed as of last month Zeek, can help you, or maybe in some cases possibly can't help you with the problems that we're going to be discussing. And could I have the next slide, please, Matt? Now, you may have heard this term defensible network architecture before, and I wanted to give a little bit of history on where it comes from and what it means, and then we'll talk about what the elements are. I began my career in the Air Force doing, back then it was not necessarily called network security monitoring, but based on the software that Todd Heberlein created called the NSM, or the Network Security Monitor. That's what we gave the name to as far as the operations we were running. And when I worked at the Air Force, I really didn't realize how good I had it at the time. We were in a situation where we took intrusion seriously. We did a decent amount of work trying to figure out what our networks look like, what assets we had. We had points of contact at every Air Force base around the world. People treated intrusions as I expected them to be treated, something that could really harm your enterprise and should be dealt with rapidly. When I left the military and I joined the civilian world, or I should say rejoined the civilian world, I wasn't born in uniform, I helped create a managed security service provider. And in some respects, it was sort of like being dropped into enemy territory as part of an airborne force. And this is how it felt to me. You would land in some country. You were obviously in enemy territory, so you didn't really know where you were. Maybe you had looked at a map previously, but you weren't quite sure because maybe the plane had deviated on its course and the wind was a factor and so forth. So you're here. You don't necessarily know who else has landed with you. You don't know if you have all your equipment. You don't know where the adversary is. Maybe you landed in a valley, so you don't have the high ground. You look around and you're expected to not only defend yourself, but to accomplish whatever the mission is that you're there to accomplish. And this is what got me on the path of thinking about defensible networks. People like to talk about having a home field advantage when you're doing security. In other words, the intruder is the foreigner. The intruder should not be familiar with your environment. At least you should be more familiar with your environment than the intruder. But that may not be the case. So I thought about this idea of the defensible network architecture as the steps that you could take, the processes you could put in place, the data that you would need to give yourself that home field advantage. And when I wrote my first book, The Tao of Network Security Monitoring, and published it in 2004, I had in the first chapter a definition of defensible network architecture, and I called it an information architecture that was monitored, controlled, minimized, and current. And I gave basically a little paragraph about each one of those items. Could I have the next slide, please, Matt? When I wrote my second book, the Extrusion Detection book, which I really like, it didn't sell as well as the first one. If you want to give this book some love, please check it out. I really like it. I wrote it at the time when we were coming out of the phase of server-side intrusions being very, very popular and into the era, which is the modern era, of client-side intrusions. In other words, prior to 2004, 2005, the way you mostly broke into an environment was you would find an internet-connected server. There would be some type of service that was listening. you would hit it with an exploit, or you would exploit a misconfiguration or some other exposure, and you would accomplish your mission, taking the data, changing the data, whatever. But around the era of 04 and 05, we started to see more intruders begin to use phishing and to exploit all sorts of parsing errors and such on client-side software. So when I wrote this book on extrusion detection, I included a whole chapter on defensible network architecture, where I said, here's how you implement those 4 steps using open source tools. Could I have the next slide, please, Matt? Well, several years passed, and I started thinking about what else needed to be done. By this time, I had done incident response work, working at Foundstone with Kevin Mandia and Keith Jones and Matt Pepe and Julie Darmstadt. And I had just started working at General Electric to create their CERT. And I realized that my original defensive network architecture or defensible network architecture idea needed to be extended. And I called it, in version 2.0 in this blog post, I said that it was monitored, inventoried, controlled, claimed, minimized, assessed, and current. And a gentleman by the name of Goran Sandal added a comment to my blog suggesting that I add measured to the 8 points of the defensible network architecture. And I really like that idea, so I added it. And could I have the next slide, please, Matt? So when I wrote my last book, I published what I called Defensible Network Architecture 2.1, and it had these points in it, that these were the elements that would give you the greatest chance of resisting compromise and to respond effectively to intrusions as they occur. So I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking about what each of these steps means, and then following that, Matt is going to discuss how Zeek logs and we'll both talk about how Zeek in general can give you, or perhaps can't give you, data that you need to accomplish each one of these steps. So can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so monitored. All of these, by the way, are in order. These are the order I think in which you should, if you had to prioritize projects for an enterprise, this is how you should approach it. And when I say enterprise, I'm talking, at least at the first cut, about a situation where you have a network, you own it, there are assets, you're responsible for them. Now, I just wrote a blog post on DOS Security blog about the need to potentially have some type of classification for networks. In other words, I'm sure there are people in the audience who work at a traditional enterprise. They have a network, they have servers, they have switching and routing infrastructure, they have middle boxes, and so forth. There are other people who work in a completely distributed environment. Perhaps they have no physical infrastructure of their own. There is no office. There is no data center. They have endpoints. They have laptops and mobile devices. They connect to cloud services. So they essentially don't own any of the networks they use. I would take one little step back from that, though, and say that if you're connecting to a network from home, generally you own that network, so you are responsible for monitoring it, in my opinion. And then there are people out there who work in operational technology environments or industrial control environments or whatever. So I believe that these steps apply regardless of the type of network you work with, and it doesn't even have to be asset-centric around computers. It can be asset-centric in terms of data. Oh, and by the way, all of you that work for cloud providers, you can do this as well. In fact, I'm pretty sure that you do accomplish these tasks because you are increasingly being the owners of not only the networks, but the data that we all use. So monitored. I begin with monitored because, in my opinion, it's the single most important thing you can do to improve your security posture and have the least impact on business operations. In 2001, probably one of the great security luminaries, Bruce Schneier, and I would put Dan Geer up there. Dan and Bruce are two of my great touchstones as far as sort of security philosophers who try to figure out these deep security questions. Bruce Schneier wrote something in one of his blogs that I think is my favorite saying of his, and it was monitor first. In other words, if you return to my story of the airborne troops who get dropped behind enemy territory, and the very first thing they should do when they get dropped into that territory is to set up sentries. In other words, they don't start digging trenches, they don't set up their artillery. The first thing they need to do is figure out if the adversary is around. You can even go about thinking about this as an active measure. You could send out scouts to figure out who's near you. So monitoring, in my opinion, is the very first thing that you should do. And it's low impact because if you take a network approach, at least in the beginning, you can look at traffic on a span port, you can install a tap, and of course that could have a little bit of an impact because you have to take an outage to install a tap if you don't have one. But just by taking a look at how your network is being used, you can learn so much about what's happening. And we'll turn to Matt in a few moments to look at what that is. So the monitored point says you want to see all your assets at the host, network, and application log levels. And assets could be the computing assets themselves. It can also be the data that is being processed by all this infrastructure. Can I have the next slide, please, Matt? So once you have the visibility to those assets and how they're being used, you want to develop an inventory. And the inventory will do things like identify where that asset is located. What's the reason? Why does it exist? What's the importance of this data? Is there a classification associated with it? How critical is this data? If it were to disappear, does anybody care? Who's the owner, and how do you contact that person? This step was directly driven by my experience at General Electric. When we first started the CERT and we were first discovering intrusions, the biggest bottleneck we had in dealing with them was not being able to find somebody responsible for an asset. So the CERT could do heroic actions, find activity, discover that it's a problem, and need to take some type of action to minimize the risk by containment or other measures. And yet we didn't know where the asset was. We didn't know what the reason for it was. We didn't know what the nature of the data on it was. We didn't know who owned it, and we didn't know how to get in touch with them. So we would spend weeks in some cases just trying to answer those questions. And when you give time to the adversary, it's going to give them a chance to accomplish their mission. So this is really a business process step, but in my opinion, it's very, very important. Have the next slide, please, Matt. Controlled. Okay, control can be sort of a controversial step. We know that in certain environments, control is seen as sort of an authoritarian measure, particularly in, say, an academic environment. And I'm certainly not talking about control from a censorship point of view or from working in a repressive government or anything like that. But I'm talking about control in the idea that if anything is allowed in your environment, it makes it very difficult to determine what's supposed to be happening and what's not supposed to be happening. So I talk here in terms of enforcing access control at the host, network, and application levels. And ideally, you want to permit authorized activities and deny everything else. Some people, or I think I've even talked about this in terms of if you have an 8-lane highway, you want to make sure that those lanes are being used properly. The problem is that, let's say you shut down a lane because it's being abused, the intruders will generally find a way to abuse those other lanes that you provide an opening to. So for example, if you only allow outbound HTTPS on port 443, then you find out that everything gets tunneled over that. Now, of course, that means there are ways to deal with it, but it's sort of a cat and mouse game or an escalation game there. Nevertheless, control is very important, especially in the situation where you find yourself in a breach. If you don't have a way to cut off the adversary, you can have a completely open network, allow anything you want, but if you don't have a way to enforce some level of control when things go bad, then what are you going to do? Disconnect from the internet? And that's actually what some people have to do. And anytime you read a newspaper story saying that some government lab has been disconnected from the internet for a couple days, you know what they've been dealing with for probably several months. Could I have the next slide, please, Matt? Claimed. Now, this is an extension of the second step. And by claimed, I mean the asset owner listed in inventory is exerting active control of the system. So this person both has the authority and the ability to do something with the asset that is assigned to his or her name. Many times I can remember doing either an incident response or working within a corporate CERT, and you would check your inventory and you would go to the person who is supposed to be responsible for the system, and they would say, well, I can't actually do anything with it. I can't interfere with the action of the system. I just don't have the ability or the authority to do that. And then you would spend or waste time escalating through your chain to try to find someone who could speak for that system. So you want to make sure that the POC that you have not only is the proper POC, but actually has the authority and the control to do something with that asset. And kind of the next slide, please, Matt. Minimized. Minimized means that the asset is offering only the services and only uses the services it needs to do its job. How many times have we seen systems that had services that were enabled that just weren't necessary for its function? The service becomes exploited, and as a result of not even taking advantage of the legitimate offerings of this system, an intruder now has access to your data. So minimization, now notice this is different from something that we'll talk about in a moment. Minimization just tries to limit the attack surface that a system presents. And it can be both on the server side or even on the client side. Next slide, please, Matt. Assessed. Now, we're pretty deep into the defensible network architecture. So at this point, we should have a lot of data about what is happening in your environment, who owns the systems. The ownership data should be the reason to have a conversation with the asset owners. So find out how they use the system, what they're doing with it, if it's operating in an expected manner, and so forth. Based on all this information, the CERT can start to assess how the risk posture of the environment and whether improvements can be made. An IRT is not just a response team. Built into that for me is detection. So finding things that are problematic. Built into that for me, again, this is me speaking as an old-time security person, is the intelligence function, so feeding the detection. And built into this as well is the idea that the process that is running the CERT, the purpose is to improve security. It's not just to run around putting out fires all the time. And I did a blog post a long time ago about going from a firefighter to a fire marshal. We want to be improving the security of the environment while making sure the business can accomplish its organizational goal. Can I have the next slide, please, Matt? And current. So notice I've gotten out of the CERT here. Current is, in my opinion, the information technology responsibility. It is not something that the CERT should be doing. The CERT may have capability, but probably doesn't have the authority. So IT, assuming that there is IT, we all know that these days IT can be outsourced or maybe is the responsibility of a cloud provider. But you want to make sure that those assets are kept up to date. And given the data that you've been collecting thus far, you'll be able to tell that that's the case, or at least you should be able to tell that's the case. And we'll have some cool examples of that shortly. And kind of the next slide, please, Matt. Now, this is the final element of DNA 2.1, and it's measured. And I appreciate Goran Sandal suggesting this because it sort of closes the loop. Without measuring how well you're doing, you don't necessarily know if you're contributing to the outcome that you're trying to achieve. So you want to take the data that you've collected and determine whether, there's a whole sort of measurements that we can talk about. I'm a very big fan of time-centric metrics. So dwell time and containment time and also those sorts of things. And I have to credit Winch Wertow for writing a nice book called Time-Centric Security in the 90s that I don't think anybody even noticed outside of myself and of other few diehard fans, but the guy should get more credit for that because he did propose a time-centric security model back when people were just thinking in terms of firewalls and probably not even patching at that point. It was mostly restricting access via firewall. So measurement is the final step of the DNA process. Can I have the next slide, please, Matt? So I included this in the slides just to show how time is very important. Imagine that you're working in intrusion where you don't have the measures that were mentioned earlier. You're not monitoring. You don't have an inventory. You're not current. You're not minimized. This is how you end up in a situation like this intrusion where someone is phished on August 13th and within a month all your data is being stolen and you end up having to hire an incident response company and essentially apologize to your voters for their taxpayer data being stolen. This intrusion was actually handled very well by the victim, but in terms of not having home field advantage, this is just an example of that. And can I have the next slide, please, Matt? I just want to conclude here with the relationship to network security monitoring. This is a chart from my book on the practice of network security monitoring. It talks about how breaking out detection and response consists of collection, analysis, escalation, and resolution. And when you take these processes, these are the steps that your IRT is taking. But when you combine them with the DNA that I mentioned just now, this is what gives you that home field advantage. It's the ability to not only execute the processes that are listed here, but knowing who to talk to, knowing so that when you need to go to escalation, you can find the right person to deal with. When you talk to that person, not only are they responsible for the system, they have the authority to do something about it, which enables resolution. When you're in the analysis phase, you know how the system should be configured. You know that it's configured as best as it could be, so you can rule out certain sorts of problems or others. This is what enables these sorts of processes to work. And could I have the next slide, please, Matt? All right. And with that, I want to turn it over to Matt. This was sort of I'm very, very excited by this. I basically was asked to do this webcast, and then I almost sort of threw the challenge over to Matt and said, Matt, I think Zeek can do this. I think there's data that's available there to show that the DNA can be done using Zeek. Remember, it used to be called open source Bro, and it's still open source. It just used to be called Bro. So Matt heroically took on this challenge and started looking through logs to see whether you could or could not support defensible network architecture using network security monitoring data as provided by Zeek. So I'm really excited to share this with you. So Matt, please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard. And hey, before we jump into it, we actually had a question come through that I wanted to bring up. And since we're on the monitored part of things, we had an attendee come through and say, for the monitored principle, how would you prioritize initiatives between host, network, and applications? Where would you start, for example?
Yeah, so I absolutely would start with network. And again, this assumes that you have a network for which you're responsible. If you're completely decentralized, you work from Starbucks, then basically just monitor your house. But if you work in any other type of environment where you are responsible for a network, industrial, operational, cloud, enterprise, I suggest you start at the network. It doesn't mean that's where you should finish, but you should start there. The reason is you will get the least common denominator in the internet age is the internet. In other words, people are using the internet. So you can put a Zeek sensor onto your network. You can see assets talking with other assets, talking to the internet, and it will tell you something. Does it tell you everything? No, it doesn't tell you everything, but you can do that without having to install an agent, without having to configure a collection for application logs, from having to send them to various locations. Now you do have to do something with the Zeek data itself, right? You need to store it somehow and present it and so forth. But in my opinion, it's the single most important thing that you can do when you start out that journey. And I would say that whether I worked for a vendor or didn't work for a vendor, I've been saying it my whole career, I've seen it work over and over and over again. And using that data that you find on the network, you can use it to justify those other initiatives. You can use it to justify getting access to the endpoint, getting access to infrastructure logs or application logs.
Yeah, exactly. And now I'm gonna actually use that. I'm gonna use your answer before I jump into some of these various log levels and some of the various insight that we get from our Zeek logs. I just want to kind of echo that point. So for everyone who's watching here, I have the fortunate opportunity to be the author of our SANS Incident Response Survey, and to echo and mirror what Richard just said. In this current day and age, it's very, very rare. Richard, I don't know if you've worked any. I know I have not. Well, I've worked one in my life where there was an incident or a breach where no network connectivity was involved whatsoever. Now, everyone, of course, obviously there's some sort of insider threats. People copy a file to a USB, they walk out the door, so on and so forth. But there's a kicker behind that. One of the steps of defensible network architecture is proving that the person on the system is the actual person on the system. Guess what? For someone to get on there and execute whatever their malicious insider actions are, I'm going to see evidence of that person taking control of that device. I'm going to see it at the network level if they authenticate over domain. Now, I may see it at the host level. So maybe there's a small percentage of cases. But to Richard's point, every other scenario that I can possibly think of, and I'll give you a blanket statement right now, every single remote attack where someone has come across country lines, oceans, state lines, whatever it may be, to perpetrate some sort of attack, there's been network connectivity involved in there as well. So I'm going to go ahead and agree and say the network is one of the core places you can start. Now, we're going to walk through this in some of our logs, But I'm even going to throw another challenge out is when it comes to detecting some of that host-to-host traffic. For example, I work with a lot of organizations who have a lot of issues tracking SMB shares and tracking PS exec activity and RDP activity. By the way, your attackers love all of these protocols as well because it makes it super easy for them to move laterally across the network. Guess what? Everything I just described touches the network in some way, shape, or form. We're going to walk through a couple of examples of how we can break these out and walk through these. But let's move on and take a look at how Zeek can be very, very useful in bringing out some of the various steps of DNA. So to Richard's point, the gauntlet was thrown, and we kind of started to have a discussion about, well, there's a lot of steps to the defensible network architecture, and there's a lot of things to be considerate of. And a lot of organizations, now I'm not saying this is the wrong way, everyone. I'm saying it's a way. A lot of organizations think that every single one of these steps is a new tool, is something new that you've got to buy and purchase and overlay. It's a brand new dashboard for your analysts to work through. And it just continues to compound and compound. I mean, I would rather have a central point of information. I'd rather have a central point of analysis, and then I'd rather supplement where I need to get more visibility. So to Richard's point earlier, I'm going to start at the network. Let's say I'm interested in database traffic, okay? That's one of the first things we'll take a look at. I need to have visibility to my database traffic because I run a huge, massive customer retention portal, and I need to have access to that. Well, guess what? That database, all of its calls, all of its activity, it reaching out to my web app, it writing database calls back as customers update information, that's going to hit the network. Then I'm going to say to myself, once I've got network traffic, then I'm going to upgrade and I'm going to say, now I'd like to bring in the application log levels as well. But as we walk through this one example, the easiest and most straightforward place where you're going to find this, and for those of you who are Zeek or former Bro users, you're going to recognize this log, and it's our con log. And my con log is going to give me visibility into, quite frankly, everything that's talking on my network. This is going to be a really straightforward assessment of IP addresses, ports, protocols, and as we can see, some of the higher layers as well. We're going to talk about some of these weird, funky looking strings. If you take a look at column 2 here, there's some funky looking strings. We're going to talk about those as we get a little bit further into some of our log analysis. So when I talk about viewing my assets, okay, not a problem. I can do that with my con log at a high level. But notice though, this doesn't really give me much insight. It doesn't really dig deeper into what some of these applications are doing. And for those of you who work in the security realm or in the incident response realm, I'll give you a really straightforward example. A user's workstation was seen communicating over port 80. That context doesn't really do much for you. But if I enrich that a little bit and I say was seen communicating over, was seen communicating over port 80 to a known bad IP? Well, okay, that gives me more context. Let's go a step further and let's say was communicating over port 80 using a non-standard binary protocol to a known bad IP during a time frame when the user is supposed to be on vacation. All of those questions I can answer, all of that data enrichment I can provide with just this simple little log right here. So I can take the various states that I'm going to be at from a security perspective and I can scale up as I need to. Now, part of this challenge was also to say, can I use Zeek to find application details? And believe it or not, Zeek has the ability to capture this as well. So this right here is actually a copy of our software log. And for those of you who have used Zeek or maybe new to Zeek or Bro, you may not be familiar with this one here. This is actually one of the coolest and like oddly useful logs that I see in most Zeek output. And as you can see, it actually has the ability to fingerprint. Now, we're not talking about a hash yet, but it has the ability to fingerprint those particular servers. Everyone, if I'm running some sort of massive web cluster or multiple web applications, or I've got, servers being spun up on the fly, we won't even get into the concept right now of containerization and serverless and so on and so forth, where protocols and ports and IPs and everything change by the millisecond. But what I want to do is say within my network traffic right here, I get insight into the levels of software that are running in my environment. So yes, I can get network connectivity. I can also zoom up and I can, zoom in, and I can also get application. And I can see we've got Nginx PHP running. Now let me pause right here. For those of you who are used to running multi-platform architecture or multi-platform infrastructures, some of you immediately gravitated towards PHP 5.6 versus PHP 7.0. Now we haven't talked yet about critical patching, but you can already see and this is one thing that I want to make sure we touch upon with Zeek right here, is you're going to see me mention a lot of the same logs again and again and again. Everyone, that is not to be redundant, nor is it to kind of bore you with some of the details. That's to show you that with Zeek, my data is already in one place. So in case anyone's curious, and this is the first time you've seen this output, this is literally, and I'm going to show you this in, I don't want to say real time, or real life, but I'm going to show you a demo in just a moment. This is just a screenshot of the logs as they are. I didn't cut, I didn't sort, I didn't enrich, I didn't push into some sort of back-end database or anything like that. This is as the data gets recorded on the system. So I literally gave you a PCAP, I gave you the logs from that PCAP, and already we're starting to gain insight into things such as different user agents. We're seeing different web servers. We're seeing a couple of suspicious things here, like WinHTTP loader and sender. Those are things I might want to dig into further if I'm not really understanding what they are. And then I get things like Cowboy, Apache, Nginx without versions inside of them. Again, not saying they're bad, but they're definitely things that I may want to dig into a little bit further. So that's step one, monitoring. Again, high level of visibility inside of my network. Now, unfortunately, the animation got messed up on this one, which is totally my fault. But step two is to inventory with Zeek. And then the next question is, okay, that's great. You have visibility. And here's how I view this next step here. Hey, Matt, that's cool. You have visibility network traffic. Congratulations. You set up a span port or you dropped a tap in place. Now, enrich that for me a little bit. Well, my software log, as you can see, already gets a mention. Okay, not a problem. I can go ahead and I can take an IP address and I can enrich the details by telling you what type of function it's performing. I can give you the software behind it. We can also do aggregate statistics, and I can give you information about traffic flows. How active is it? When is it top talking? When is it, when is it quiet? A really good way to find C2 activity is to look for those patterns inside of this activity here. The other way that I can tie this back to, and again, everyone, this is just inside of default Zeek logs here. The other thing that I can do is I can also go through and pivot and take a look at my DHCP leases. So in this particular instance right here, and again, this is just a sample PCAP that I have, I can now start to tie back my IP addresses as well as their DHCP information. We're going to talk about those funky looking strings a little bit later, but just note that between logs like this, like DHCP and software, I can gain that extra level of visibility into my environment that, gives me that inventoried side. Now this is where it starts to get a little curious. Can we control a network with Zeek? And I know some organizations who will say, no, IDSs should only be put in a passive manner. They should only be installed and monitoring traffic. They should never be put in place. Richard called it out perfectly at the beginning when he said some folks are so terrified of controlling their traffic, a fear of being labeled, something incorrect when it comes to protecting your network. I'm going to throw this challenge down to you right now. If you don't have the ability to block traffic from leaving your network, then you basically have given the attackers all they need to exfiltrate that data. Because here's what's going to happen, everyone. And I don't want to scare you. And this is not meant to be any sort of FUD or anything like that. This is just my experience. I've seen with my own eyes, I've seen an incident turn from initial stages all the way up into total exfiltration, monetary losses walk out the door because of arguments over a change control about a firewall block. Now, I'm not saying change controls don't have their place. What I'm saying is this. I'm saying we need to have ways for the security team and for the incident response team to respond to events and to permit only authorized activities and deny things that should not take place. And I'll give you all a really much easier example. Let's think about things like Eternal Blue, WannaCry, Petya, not Petya. I would like to hear a valid reason for not blocking those signatures, for not blocking that traffic the moment those exploits are released. See, I knew you all had a temperature for blocking, right? We do. We just got to find out what that threshold is. And we've got to make sure that our tools can take care of that. Now, I have to give a shout out here. There's actually a presentation from BroCon a whopping 4 years ago. The nice part about it is 4-year-old technology is still, now Bro itself obviously is just a tad older than 4. But, in this case, we've got a presentation, and I'm going to give a throwback here. that we can, if we want within Bro, drop in exploit-specific blocking. So I can actually write Bro signatures. That's right, everyone. Now, I'm saying Bro signatures only so that to help you with the Google. Obviously, remember that Bro has been changed to Zeek here, but you will find a wealth of information out there about writing signatures inside of Zeek that you can use to block, alert on, control all different kinds of traffic. See, we don't want to block users from being users. We want to block attackers from being attackers. So that's the important distinction. And when I make that distinction, all of a sudden my security team is empowered and they can do the things that they need to do. So I can write signatures to do exploit-specific blocking. The same exact walkthrough, actually also a presentation, also talks about on-the-fly connection ACLs. Think about how crucial this is right here. Being able to drop in timed, zero latency ACLs to help close in those attackers. Now, I know Richard's mentioned this a handful of times, and he's also mentioned it in many of his books as well that I've had the fortunate opportunity to read. But I want you all to start thinking about, all right, well, if I'm not going to block the attacker out immediately, maybe I can start to close the walls on them a little bit. We're going to get into that concept of active defense, where I'm not kicking the attacker out immediately, but I'm instead keeping an eye on what they're doing for the purposes of gathering intelligence, for the purposes of seeing how do they do when I do this. And I'll give you all a really, really easy example as to why you want to do this. If you've got a firewall with pretty tight restricted ports on it, you're going to want to see how quickly your attacker can pivot, because there's a huge difference between kicking the attacker out and blocking the attacker on port 80. But the nice thing about Zeek is it gives me the capability here to drop in these on-the-fly connection ACLs that I can use to block my internal out traffic. I can also, if I've got Zeek at the perimeter, prevent some of these other scans and some of this other nefarious activity taking place. Now, I'll be completely frank with you all. I would not try and have the one Zeek instance in the world that is keeping up with the hum of the internet, if you will. What I'm going to recommend instead is spend the time to understand those Zeek blockades, those Zeek signatures, and use those to your advantage to, once again, on the fly, deploy these rules and signatures that can stop malicious traffic from leaving throughout your network or can give you those specific alerts. So controlling we can do. The next step, claiming. How can I prove that the person listed in inventory actually exerts control over that particular system? This one's a little bit tougher because Zeek, to my knowledge, is not a webcam that I can just turn on and make sure that when Richard says he's logged in, he's actually logged in. This one I had to dig a little bit deeper. But here, I'm going to take our challenge from question 1. So if you all remember, back in question 1, we started talking about if I had to focus on host-based, network-based, or application-based data, where would I start? Here's another reason. Because my host artifacts are the ones that are going to help me determine who's exactly exerting control over that system. And take a look. I've got 2 different sources. So there's my DHCP again. Okay. Now DHCP helps me tie together again that physical and that physical and that IP address, so that way I can prove who's got what. But let's tie these things together a little bit better. And let's say, guess what else Zeek has the ability to detect and decode? It also has the ability to pick up that Kerberos traffic. Now, it also can pick up NTLM, but I felt like keeping us a little bit more current. And I do have the ability inside of my Zeek logs to also start to profile Kerberos activity. So that I can then, again, without pivoting outside of a single text file, outside of a single Zeek log, I can now start to pivot and see, based on DHCP leases, what was this device, based on Kerberos activity, based on ticket assignments. Again, there's NTLM as well, based on NTLM authentications. Can I determine the user that logged in? Everyone, I just took Windows event logs and the reliance on Windows event logs, and I made that a little bit smaller because I can see the exact same traffic across the network. And to the individual who asked that question a little bit earlier on, I was kind of wanting to wait to get to this slide right here to show you when you talk about pulling host-based artifacts, I'm really going to start to say, pull the log entries that you can't capture inside of your network activity. And that right there makes you a significantly more powerful security team. Because, and let me know if this sounds familiar to those of you watching the webcast or those of you watching the recording. I know you're going to get a chuckle for sure. Let me know if this sounds familiar. You go to open the SIM to do log analysis, And yep, there's 8 million events that don't have anything to do with what it is you're interested in. So now you've got to spend your time as an analyst sifting through all of that noise, sifting through all of those details and all of those log entries to get to the one of interest, to get to the one that you're curious about. Guess what? With Zeek, it's all right there. I can tie it together a lot faster because I'm not dealing with all the other noise that takes place. Okay, so our next question was, minimize with Zeek. The assets provide the minimum surface area required to perform their business function. This one's a little bit tougher here. Can I use Zeek to minimize how my systems are working on the network? Well, number one, again, we've got to go back to our software log. And this is going to be some of my important metrics, because if I'm expecting to be running 3 web servers in my environment, this count better never go above 3. If I see it go above that, I'm going to get a little bit curious. Number two, when we talk about minimizing my attack surface, and this is where I start to bring in some of those newer technologies, and I know Richard gave plenty shout outs to cloud providers, but when we start to bring in some of those newer technologies here, and I've got to think once again about those containerizations, I've got to think about all those various applications that can spin stuff up on the fly, having this level of insight helps me deal with that particular surface area. Not only that, but everyone, there's also one of my favorite Zeek logs ever called weird.log. And weird just picks up on stuff that quite frankly just does not make sense. Now, some of this is just basic networking, you know, DNS with unmatched messages and unknown replies and so on and so forth. So some of it's not going to be an indication of maliciousness. But there's going to be some other things taking place where you're like, that just doesn't seem right to me whatsoever. And if you look at a weird log long enough, you're going to start to see patterns. And you're going to be like, wait, why is it that between 2 and 4 a.m. every Saturday and Sunday, the same types of messages pop up? I know that's my backup window, but this isn't related to the backup server. See, questions like that are really, really hard to answer if all you've got is that host-based data. So this once again speaks to it. So yes, can I use Zeek to minimize the surface? What I can do is I can use Zeek to gain insight into my service area, and then I can minimize from there as well. So let's go a little further. Assessing. The CERT routinely evaluates the configuration of the assets. Well, guess what? Software gets another mention here. That software log, and I remember I told you all this is going to be somewhat repetitive because I get all this critical data in one place. So software.log is going to be one of my other key locations here because once again, it's bringing the stuff that I need to know about my environment into one place. Now, as you all may have noticed, a lot of what I've picked up on as these various log sources have been server focused. We're focusing on server software. We're focusing on, server vulnerabilities, server attack surface. One thing we have not dug into yet, which we'll take a look at in just a moment, is going to be how my users are represented on the network as well. Because when we talk about, and I'm going to go back a slide here, when we talk about things like the minimum surface area required to perform their business function, a lot of people think, all right, am I serving any web shells out of my web server? Is my web server also being repurposed as an SFTP? Is that opening all these additional things? I'll give you a much easier example. Do I have a workstation in finance that is communicating via RDP to a workstation in HR? And is that activity normal? That right there is definitely going to be something that I'm going to alert on, that I'm going to pick up on. So I can assess and I can minimize with Zeek as well. And then lastly, look at that, software gets another mention because Richard also threw another challenge down, which was, can you keep yourself current? Can you make sure that you're patching and configuration with the latest standards? Now, here's where I will waver a little bit. Zeek is not a patching tool whatsoever, but Zeek gives me that insight and that visibility into the level of application and the level of services that my various tools are running. We're going to take a look at our host-based data in just a moment here, and we're going to walk through that and see how we can get insight there as well. But yes, I can use Zeek to get insight into status and configuration. Now, as you all may have noticed, we spent, as I mentioned earlier, a good amount of time inside of the software log, primarily because that brings the information that I want right to the surface. Because everyone, there are definitely a billion different ways I can slice and dice these different data elements. But like most of you out there, I don't have the time to come up with some fancy way to couple this stuff together. What I need are answers so I can make decisions kind of quickly and right in front of me here. And that brings me to my very last one. which is, can we use Zeek to measure? Now, at this point, I'm going to give a little bit of an omission, and I'm going to say, here's one thing that Zeek is not. Zeek is not necessarily a historical tracker of information that gives you comparison metrics out of the box, that gives you comparison metrics that give you year over year. So I'm actually going to come back and I'm going to say, all right, network folks, security folks, incident response folks, this one's dependent on you. Now, I want to rope in a little bit of recent real world experience here to kind of tie this together. When we talk about measuring progress inside of the defensible network architecture, what we are talking about is from month to month or 6 months to 6 months or year to year or whatever that metric is, your number of headaches goes down. Your number of hurdles, your number of stress points goes down. I'm not saying you're not being attacked anymore. What I'm saying is the time it takes your team to respond should be going down. We should be learning. We should be sharing those metrics in between our teams, and we should be using them to maintain visibility inside of the organization. And this just came through last week, so some of you may recognize this from year to year, but last week we actually released the 2018 SANS Incident Response Survey. And in this year's Incident Response Survey, we found that a double-digit percentage of organizations had been hit by the same threat actor at least twice. At least twice. Now, I gave a little bit of a shout out last week, or not a shout out, but a little bit of a discussion last week about remediation, and I gave a little bit of a discussion about effective containment and indicator and intelligence development. But when we talk about measuring with Zeek, when we talk about using this to your advantage, this is where you need to have that visibility, and it needs to be key to understand the threat. Because here's one thing that you can't get from the host that the network traffic will be able to give you. The host is going to roll. Those logs are going to change. They're going to disappear. It's also pretty easy to get rid of a lot of that different data there. What's not easy to do is to somehow find your way inside of those network devices and modify all of the different flow and PCAP data and Zeek logs and everything that's being captured as these attackers are going through and performing this various activity. Because unfortunately, they need that reliability there. But if we're not tracking those metrics, if we're not tracking that visibility, and if we're not tracking our team effectiveness, we're never going to get to the point to understand just how well we've progressed. So I hate to say that the last one is on you, but without a doubt, the very last one is on you and your team. With Zeek, you've got all the insight, you've got all the data, you've got all the visibility that you'll need to actually make this happen. Go and start counting, start assessing, start measuring, start containing, and then give your team a chance to respond back and to have some sort of an idea of how well the organization is doing. Now, with that, we're actually at the end of our information here, but before we get to the Q&A, I'm going to hop over really quick to my VM that I've got running, and some of you who have taken some of our SANS classes may recognize this, but I just wanted to walk through a couple different things that I'm going to get inside of Zeek that I may not get elsewhere. And Carol or Richard, can I get a quick thumbs up that you can see my screen?
Looks good.
Perfect. All right. So what I want to do is we just took a really, really simple PCAP here. And as you notice, there's actually a PCAP inside of here. A huge shout out to Brad over at Malware Traffic Analysis, because he gives us the ability to view all these wonderful PCAPs again and again. And everyone, this is where I have to kind of do like a little mic drop moment or a little bombshell moment. Every single thing that we just walked through, every single Zeek log and concept that we just walked through and talked through was me analyzing someone else's network. Richard made a very good point earlier about if you are responsible for a network, you should be monitoring that network. And I'll tell you what, there's been plenty of network admins I've sat down at the table with, and they know that network like the back of their hand. They know it really, really well. But with Zeek, I can take a network that I've never had insight into whatsoever, and I can immediately start to profile things out. And you can see just how quickly we have the capability to move through some of these various features. So here's my log set generated from this particular PCAP right here. Now let's start at the top, and notice I can take a look just straight at my conlog information here. And my conlog, which is going to feel very, very similar to NetFlow, as I mentioned, is going to give me that insight into the various activity, the various traffic that's taking place inside of my network. By the way, since we're talking about Zeek, everyone, I want to make sure we pick up on some of these unique IDs right here. See these funky looking, I don't know if this is going to make sense, like base 64-ish kind of strings? These are actually Zeek specific UIDs. This particular UID is going to be respective to this connection. And believe it or not, I can actually take that particular UID and I can search throughout all my logs here, and I can look for evidence of where that took place. And from connection, I can now tie together that Kerberos connectivity. This is where Zeek levels up your incident response and security teams. I did not have to go to a Windows event log. I did not have to log into a domain controller. I did not have to get in any sort of Windows authentication whatsoever. What I had to do was look at 2 log entries and pivot off of one easy value. So right there, at step 1, I'm starting to understand, all right, who's being assigned tickets? What type of tickets are they being assigned? Are they successfully authenticating, or am I seeing some sort of brute force activity take place? Let's back up. Again, here's another area where Zeek is super crucial in profiling your environment because it's protocol aware. So not only am I able to start to inventory my assets, I can also start to inventory, and zoom out with me here, everyone. I can also start to inventory my connections, because now I can say, all right, take a look. I've got DNS activity taking place, and we can dig into DNS if we want, and we can see those resolutions. We can see those IPs. We can see those requests. I can take a look at DNS, and every single DNS analytic you've ever heard of, we can throw against that log. I can also, if I want, take a look and say, wait a second, I've got SMB activity taking place. I've got someone moving files across the network here. And then depending on where it is I'm logging from, this may or may not be something that I'm expecting to see. Notice here, I can actually see some group policy information take place. I'm okay with that. But then I come across things like this. Now, I haven't been in security as long as some folks, but I'll tell you right now, that is most likely not a legitimately named executable. That's usually not how those things work. So everyone, here's what I did. Check this out. I just went from my con log, where I was getting insight into my assets, immediately to something of concern, immediately to a security event of concern. Let's back away. Let's say, okay, we've already got something to dig on. By the way, everyone, this is the very first time I've looked at this particular PCAP here with any sort of an investigative lens. And within 2 searches, we're already at evidence of suspicion. 2 searches. And that was only because I started a con log first. If I had actually started to analyze some of that SMB traffic first, we would have got there even faster. But let's zoom back out and let's say, all right, Matt, we're talking about defensible network architecture. One of our steps was to understand and assess our users. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a look and see what our users are doing. And here I'm going to go and enumerate my SSL activity. And this is where I'm going to have the capability to enumerate my users, the remote IPs that they're reaching out to. I'm going to start to get certificate information. And then some of you watching are going to start to recognize some of these things as well. I'm going to start to come across things like this, which are my JA3 hashes. I've got a huge shout out to the Salesforce folks because they are hashing machines when it comes to network architecture and network traffic. But what I'm starting to do now is I'm starting to take traffic. Now, this is to Rich's point earlier. I'm starting to take traffic that is very traditionally encrypted and kind of left by the wayside. Left by the wayside information and metadata that I've now got insight to, which is very, very useful to have because I just took a traffic source that a lot of folks typically disregard, and now I'm starting to build profiles around it as well. And this JA3 hash, which is a fingerprint of that SSL connectivity on the client side, is now going to give me insight into some of the various things that are being served up, some of the various things that my users are accessing. Are people accessing the internet via a web browser, or are they accessing the internet via some sort of built-in Python library? Those 2 things look very, very, very different. Now, Matt, we could continue. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to mention, so the thing that really impresses me about what you've done so far is you're showing data that is just what you need in order to answer these questions. If you had NetFlow logs, you would have source and dest IPs and source and dest ports and byte counts, but you wouldn't have the detail about what's going on here. If you had PCAP, which you do in this case, you're able to work with it because these PCAPs are like 14 megabytes or something like that. But in an enterprise, you could have gigs and gigs of traffic representing SSL inbound or outbound, SMB traffic from host to host. It would just be so much that you just have, in some cases, you'd have a storage issue or at least a searching issue But with the logs that you've been able to show me, this is like the stuff that I need to be able to answer these questions in a very compact, easy to parse format.
Yep. And Richard, that is actually the perfect segue to my exact final line. And I was literally going to do the exact same thing you just did verbally, which is everyone, that PCAP is 16 megs in size. The logs that we just looked through average between 1 and 20 kilobytes in size. So my last and final push here for the power of Zeek when it comes to a defensible network architecture is I gained all of that insight, all of that intelligence, all of those findings, all of those different details without opening Wireshark, number one, which I'm not saying that's bad, but I'm saying I got the answers fit quickly and faster. And number two, I did it with significantly less data. So for those of you who are having to butt up against, well, how do I record everything? That's okay, because we've got logs that give us that level of metadata that we can use to drill in further when you need to. Perfect. All right. Well, I am going to hop back over to our presentation because I feel like I've done enough of an excited walkthrough for Zeek that I want to see to get to some of these questions before we run out of time, Richard. But let's see here. So I'm going to take a look at some of these easy ones. And since we just talked about this really quick, Richard, I'm going to throw this to you first because you mentioned it. So I'm going to say that you volunteered here. How does the con log compare to NetFlow?
Yeah. So the con log in terms of what it contains is generally the same as NetFlow with an important exception, and that is that UID that you mentioned. So when Zeek starts tracking a connection, it'll assign a UID, and then that UID will appear in not only the con log, but derived logs, which represent higher level protocols. So if you're trying to do any kind of data science and you're always looking for some way to link the data that you're collecting in different formats, Zeek has already solved that for you through that UID. So NetFlow does not have that. Although, if NetFlow is the only thing that you have, go ahead and collect it because it's better than nothing. But with Zeek, you're able to get not only the same level of detail in the connection log, but you get that UID, which then allows you to link it to the SMB log, the FTP log, the Kerberos log, DHCP, and so forth.
Correct. Yep. And I agree 100%. And hopefully everyone was able to see the correlation that we were able to do there. Okay. Next, and I'll answer this one first, and then Richard, see if you got any follow-up here. We had a question come through, which is, do you recommend to run Zeek inline for traffic analysis or feed PCAPs to it that were captured from another device? I'm going to go out and say, because one of our DNA steps, or one of our DNA requirements, if you will, is to have the ability to control access and to have the ability to put blocks into place. And I would like to do that with one central thing. I'm going to say I would like to have it deployed in line. That's my first one, is because I want to have the ability to use the power of Zeek to drop in, as I mentioned earlier, those exploit blocks, those ACLs. I want to have the ability to defeat those attackers if I can. But here's the other reason why I'd recommend having it in line. When we're getting to the level of network traffic analysis and we're getting to that incident response and that security response arena, the faster we can detect and respond to things is the advantage that my blue team or my IR team or my SOC or whomever has compared to the attacker. And this is going to sound like a really short amount of time, but to an attacker it can be forever. If I'm experiencing a 1.5 to 2 minute delay, just 2 minutes, everyone, 2 minutes, that's all you need. 2 minutes to ship PCAPs from one server to another, to then be processed by Zeek, to then be ingested, to then be thrown into some sort of a thing, so on and so forth. Those 2 minutes can mean the difference between least privileges and domain administrator. I've seen it done faster. So my recommendation is going to be get it in line, because I need and I want your team to be as close to the data and as fast on the response as possible. Rich, I don't know if you have anything to follow up or disagreement maybe.
Yeah, no, I agree. When I think in line, though, I think in terms of it has it is in the path of traffic. It's such that if the box failed, it might take down the network. In that respect, I would prefer it be on a tap, or if you have to, you do a span port and a switch. The other mode that I tend to think of is more of a forensic mode. So if you're doing some type of post analysis, then Zeek will support that just fine. You can just read the traffic into Zeek as Matt was showing. And I just want to mention one thing with like only a few seconds left. If you can do this sort of analysis that Matt was doing, like you download a PCAP from Malware Traffic Analysis, you look through it, These are the sorts of things employers are looking for. And Zeek is a wonderful keyword to have in your LinkedIn profile. So go ahead and play around with it. Download PCAPs, run them through Zeek, and see what you can make sense of it. And it is a wonderful way to start a security career if you're at that point.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. And with that, everyone, I'm going to say my final parting thoughts and just say I agree 100%. Richard brought up some very, very excellent points. I hope you all enjoyed this presentation on defensible network architecture. I know we enjoyed walking through. Obviously, if there's any questions you have, Carol, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about any follow-up questions. But other than that, thank you, everyone, for joining. And we look forward to seeing you out there on the webs or in the world of Zeek.
All right, yeah, so any questions can be submitted to q@sans.org, and I can forward them to the appropriate person. So thank you so much, Richard Bejtlich and Matt Bromiley, for your great presentation, and to Corelight for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.